Today's reading comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, verses 21 through 27, through 28. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Then Jesus told his disciples, If any wants to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world, but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Good morning.
Good morning.
So you've learned my name. My name is Jeremy Langill, and I am the executive minister for the Rhode Island State Council of Churches. Some of you probably know that your very own Randy is a member of the board at the State Council of Churches. One night he and I met in here to discuss the very exciting world of websites and constant contact.
Yeah.
And as I was walking to my car later that night, he said to me, Hey, would you be open to being on call to preach? And a couple of days later, I got the email for today.
Yeah.
I'm very grateful that Randy and I had that meeting, which is allowing me to be with you all this morning. Let me start by saying a little bit about myself. As it's been mentioned, I am a Southern California native. I was born and raised in Pasadena, and later I want to know what that shout-out was for. There we go. Which is the home of the Rose Bowl, probably the greatest college football game in the country. And also the Tournament of Roses, that very fancy parade on January 1st with all the flowers. We can do that in Southern California in January because it's 65 and sunny. I grew up in a congregational setting. It was a mainline church that during the 80s evolved, changed, developed into a non-denominational megachurch. And it became aligned during that time with that group of folks called the moral majority, Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertsons. And during that time, at least by the time I was a senior in high school in the 90s, a newly hired youth minister was preaching his first sermon. And in that sermon, he was talking about a 6,000-year-old earth. And I thought after that sermon, so I thought that was strange. And after that sermon, we happened to have our student leadership team meeting, and I brought up the fact that seemed a little bit outside the kind of bounds of my knowledge. And I was a very good science student, and I really liked physics and all those kinds of things. And I was promptly asked to lead the leadership team. So I did. At the same time, I was trying to figure out next steps for college. Now, I was the first person in my family to go to college, so we didn't really know what to do. We didn't know anything about FAFSAs or that whole process. And so I ended up going to a private Christian college just down the road, 20 minutes, without traffic, so 45 minutes. And I went there because, my family knew about it, and also because my piano teacher at the time I was a musician, was the newly installed dean of the School of Music. So it seemed like a convenient thing to do. It was safe, and I knew the music, it was in the music department, and I could live at home, and it was cheaper and the whole thing. Well, I ended up graduating with a degree in philosophy, a minor in biblical studies, and no real faith to speak of. Now, I want to be clear, my lack of faith, if you want to call it that, wasn't because of philosophy or biblical studies. In fact, philosophy and biblical studies were the only thing keeping me in this kind of question of faith. But that time for me was marked as what I refer to as my wandering in the desert. And I want to be clear about that too. I don't think that faith is a linear thing. I don't think that, our spiritual lives are marked by shifts and moving from what is perceived as traditional to liberal or some other movement like that. That's not what I'm saying. Really, for me, my own spiritual life has been marked by an orientation towards curiosity. Curiosity. Towards a way of being that embraces ambiguity and doubt. But this wasn't always the case. After taking a break from graduate school, I ended up taking a job as the director of youth ministry at an Episcopal church in Pasadena. I wasn't really sure what to expect, but the reality is, after spending 11 years there, I was deeply transformed in ways that I could never have imagined. It was there at All Saints that I first learned about Richard Rohr. Richard Rohr is a Franciscan friar who has a genuine and provocative interest in moving Christianity and faith beyond the narrow confines of our institutions and personal agendas. He not only engages in deep conversation with Christians across the theological and denominational spectrums, but he also learns from and integrates knowledge and wisdom from many of the world's great religions. In his book, Falling Upward, Rohr explores this idea of what he calls the first half of life and the second half of life. In the simplest terms, the first half of life is that part of our life where we are constantly building, expanding beyond, and rebuilding our container, which Rohr essentially likens to our ego, or our sense of self. The ways in which we measure and evaluate our own self-worth. It's the formative years of our adolescence, our young adulthood, the parts of our life where we are learning, building careers, starting families, that kind of activity. In contrast, the second half of life are the moments in which we begin to move beyond the first half of life activity of container building. It's the voice inside of us that calls us or draws us into serious self-reflection and introspection. It's the realization that there is more to life than just our egos. That there is more than just the simple binary of the good guys and the bad guys. It's the part of life that is unafraid to seriously engage doubt, nuance, confusion, and the other. Because a person in the second half of life realizes that there are more important ways of being than all the things that we accumulated in our first half of life containers. It is the process of moving away from either-or thinking, embracing both and thinking. Jesus, of course, gives us many examples of second half of life thinking. Jesus tells us to not only pray for those we love, but to also pray for our enemies. When the authorities come to arrest Jesus, he commands his disciples to put their swords down. He even heals the ear of the servant of the high priest, that Peter, in his first half of life eagerness to defend Jesus, had cut off. Jesus spends his ministry including many, many people who had been made outcasts in his first century community. Post-resurrection, when Jesus appeared to Peter and the disciples who tried to go back to fishing, Jesus reminds them that their life's work had grown beyond their first half of life containers. They are to be fishers of people, bringing the good news of God's love for all of creation. In Jesus' post-resurrection appearance to the disciples in the locked room, he reminds them that they are not to live lives of fear. They are to live lives of peace, grace, and gratitude. Today's gospel lesson reminds me of the challenge of living into the second half of life, of living into a posture of curiosity, grace, and gratitude. Peter. This poor guy. In the passages just preceding this one, Peter was the only one to take that transformational step of walking on the water. He's already been identified as a disciple unique amongst the others, and he really seems to be getting on board with this whole Jesus thing. And then we see him having a perfectly normal response to when someone gives you difficult news. Jesus has said that they have to go to Jerusalem so that he can undergo great suffering, and Peter's response is basically, nope, let's just not do that. After all that Peter has seen and done, he cannot understand why Jesus has to go through the events of Holy Week and death on a cross. And Jesus' response is even more intense. I remember, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Talk about a workplace disagreement. I think this moment illustrates how first half of life and second half of life living is often intermingled and nonlinear. It goes without saying that not every person who has been blessed with many years on this planet is a person who lives into a second half of life mentality. Peter has brilliant moments of second half of life thinking, and then occasionally, like we all do, falls back into the familiarity of the first half of life container. In my own spiritual walk, I have found that inhabiting an attitude of gratitude when I'm able to, that's sometimes hard with a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old at home, helps me to stay grounded and to not miss those moments of second half of life transformation. From a neuroscience perspective, I told you I like science. Research seems to suggest that fear and gratitude do not reside in the same part of our brain. In fact, fear resides in the reptilian part of our brain down here. That's the part of the brain that helps us to quickly assess risk and compels us to either flee or fight. While feelings of gratitude activate the mammalian part of our brain, which is generally associated with higher and more reasoned thinking. Feelings of gratitude, grace, and love allow us to process our fear in a way that helps us to stop being fearful. Feelings of gratitude quite literally move us out of fear. Jesus' remark to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," is not meant to suggest that Peter has endorsed or is acting a satanic way, and we could do another sermon on that later and what that means in the first century. But it is meant to draw our attention to the reality that Peter has slipped back into a fear-based way of thinking. He's taken up residence in his first half of life container. He's embraced a kind of domesticated faith. Jesus' quick call out is to snap him out of it, to help him move from the house of fear into the house of love. At the end of the reading, we see that Jesus is trying to draw our attention to the reality that what we do matters. His remarks are framed in an eschatological context, and eschatology is just the study of the ending of things. There are religious eschatologies and secular eschatologies and scientific eschatologies. In other words, they're designed to snap us out of our comfort zones, to spur us into a place of growth, where we let go of our fear and embrace resurrected living. Resurrected living embraces the other. It understands the limit and unhelpfulness of either or thinking, debase the vision of the world into a kind of black and white perspective. A resurrected life understands the both-handedness of the world that we live in. It empowers us and helps us to build a faith rooted in love, compassion, and maturity. Resurrected living means moving beyond the egotistical and self-serving containers of our first half of life and into the reflective, empathic, and inclusive nature of the second half of life. Resurrected living is not a domesticated faith. It can't be stopped. In our daily lives, it can be easy to slip into a kind of domesticated faith. And something that I have noticed, especially when I'm leading retreats with youth and adults, is that personal growth very rarely happens in the ordinary. Rather, we are most open to change when we find ourselves leading into the challenge spaces, when we engage the reality of the complexity of the world around us, and when we embrace a resurrected kind of living. A way of being in the world that takes all the things that we've learned from our first half of life containers and activates that old egotistical sense of self for personal and communal transformation. A way of being that says goodbye to domestication so that we can become cracked open for the work that lies ahead. Amen. On our hymn number 708, we are going to sing all 4 verses.